Welcome back, everyone. On my Cascade Duffle bag tutorial, I had a few people ask to show the different panel options that are available for the color blocking within the Cascade. So we have the blocked, the striped, and the rainbow color blocking options. And I'll be sewing through each of these today. I've broken the tutorial up into 3 other parts outside of this intro, so you can easily follow along within the timestamps for each. I'm going to work backwards from how they are in the instructions and kind of work up the difficulty level for each panel as I sew the blocking version first, followed by the striped version, and then the rainbow color blocking. On my blocked version, I did do a panel as one of the commenters on my Cascade Duffle talked about wanting to use a 10 by 10 panel for the blocked version. And it did work out great. I was able to trim away some of this one for the midi size, so I did have some room to work with. If you do have a panel that doesn't fit as it's too small, you can always do a frame around it, especially if you want to use the panel for the full size. You'll need to add a little striping to either just the top or just the bottom, or top and bottom, and like frame it. But you can definitely make the panels work. And I think this one turned out super cute. So let's go ahead and walk through first our pattern pieces for our block and get sewing this one. If you would like to sew one of the other 2, you can go ahead and skip to that part of the tutorial first. We'll walk through the pattern pieces for our blocked panel for the color blocking. Now I am going to use a panel as one of the pieces, as it was requested in the comments of the Cascade Duffle. Now I'm going to make the mid-size, and since I'm making the mid-size, this particular 10 by 10 panel worked out great for it. I just had to trim it down just a little bit around the sides according to the pattern piece. But if you were going to make the full size, you could definitely go ahead and make a border around it to make up that extra height. And you could do it either on the top, just the bottom, or you can do it on the top and the bottom. It just make it to where it's the same amount of height on each, but it fits the length of the full panel. Now here I'm just going to use this. Now keep in mind this was trimmed down, so this isn't a perfect 10 by 10, but it uses a 10 by 10 panel. This is piece D of the color block. And then here is C, B, and A. So you would need 4 pieces for the block color blocking option. And then for your block color blocking, you will sew all your pieces together before you stabilize it with your stabilizer. So we'll sew all these together and then stick on the panel stabilizer of your choice. If you want, you can switch around the layout and play with the sizing. It's definitely completely up to you what way you want them to go. You can even flip it to where your the big section comes first, and then you work your way out. So there are these pieces for the block, and we'll get sewing this one. Now for our blocked color blocking, I'm gonna take my piece A and my piece B and place those both right sides up, so I can place those right sides together along the edge of where A and B meet. I'm gonna sew with a 3/8 seam allowance. And then you would open this up and give it a press. Now you can either open the seam completely up and press, and you could top stitch down each side if you wanted to, or you can press it to one side or the other and then top stitch on that given side of which you press to. Now if you are using, say, a panel like I am and you want top stitching on your panel side, what you're gonna do is you're gonna press your seam off to your right and top stitch this side of your panel, which is what I'm going to do. But if you didn't want top stitching on that panel, you would press to the other side. I'm gonna top stitch with a 1/8 seam allowance. There's your first part, and we'll continue on with piece C. And you'll take piece C right side up and place those right sides together. And now sew this with that 3/8 seam allowance. Now, depending on your materials, you might find it helpful to help reduce your bulk by snipping your seam allowance corners. And press this one out again. I'm only pressing to the one side, but remember you can press it open. And you could do top stitching on both sides if you want it. Now we'll have our one last panel to attach. And this is the one I'm using that panel, that printed panel for. Place that right sides together with the rest of our connected panels. And again, sew with a 3/8 seam allowance. Open and top stitch. So there would be your completed Now this would be your completed block panel. Then you would go ahead and fuse your stabilizer on the back. You would use whatever long side panel size option that you are using. So for like this one is the mid size option. So I'd grab the long mid size stabilizer and then fuse that on the back of here. And this will then be one of my long side panels. So I'm gonna go ahead and sew up the striped version if you'd like to see that. We're gonna walk through our pattern pieces for it, and then I'm gonna sew that one up. Now for our striped color blocking option, You'll have 5 pieces for this one. You'll have your piece A, B, C, D, and E. And I will say, when you're cutting your pattern pieces out, make sure that you're cutting them facing the same way. So if you cut with this pattern piece up for one piece, make sure that all your pattern pieces are facing up and that you don't end up flipping over a pattern piece to fit within a fabric, or else you'll end up with 2 pieces that are not matching and it won't fit together. Here is our striped colored blocking, and we can get to sewing this one. Let's go ahead and sew up our stripe version. These part of the instructions are on page 45 and 46. You start out with your big piece of A, and you have the bigger chunk of A, and then one of your stripes of B. You'll have those both right sides up, and then you'll flip them to where the right side's together and clip along that long edge. And you'll continue to clip up that long edge. And you'll see that that point will be flat against that. And then same thing with this. So that edge is nice and flat against it. Now we'll sew with a 3/8 seam allowance. You can go ahead and press out. If you want, you can just press out. You can press them open. It is completely up to you. If you press that seam open, I would recommend top stitching both sides of the seam. If you only press it one way, then you will just top stitch that one seam. So you can also make the decision not to top stitch at all. I would just ensure that you then give a very good press. Make sure everything stays in one place before you add one more stabilizer. Press mine up. So then I'm top stitching on the bigger panel. And I'm going to top stitch with a 1/8. There's your first part, and now you'll take your stripe C, place those right side up, and then flip it to where it's right sides together, and again clip along that long seam. And then repeat those previous steps. So with a 3/8 seam allowance. Press, and because I pressed this one seam that way, I'm going to continue to press my seams that way. And top stitch again with that 1/8. There's the 3 parts connected. We're gonna grab our stripe D, place that right side up again, and then flip it to where the right side's together. And once clipped, so with that 3/8 seam allowance. And again, press that seam and top stitch. And now our final piece of E, again, both all right side up, and you'll flip that to where the right side's together. And then sew with that 3/8 seam allowance, and you can see from this one a little bit better than the other ones that when you're lining up those fabrics, that your sides of your stripe that you're adding will lay flat along the seams. Okay, so again, that 3/8. And then you can also see that with your seam allowance, it meets perfectly at those points. And press that back. So then you have a nice straight seam at the sides. Okay, top stitching with a 1/8. Now, that is your completed stripe panel. You can either have this way or even this way, depending on what way you cut your fabrics and if you have a directional print or not. And then now, once your panel is completed, you can go ahead and then interface your stabilizer on the back. And this will be one of your long side pieces. I'm now going to walk through the pattern pieces for the rainbow before I sew that one, and we'll move on to our rainbow striped option. Now for our rainbow color blocking, you'll also have 5 pieces for this one. So you have your piece A, and then B, C, D, and E. And then for this one, you also want to make sure that you are cutting your pattern pieces all the right way. So if you cut with this writing facing up, make sure that you cut all your pieces that way versus trying to cut one this way, because then you'll have a backwards piece. So make sure they're cutting them all the same way. If you did want to flip this panel, then you would do the mirrored images of all your pieces. For this version in particular, it does help, especially like if you're using cotton woven, to not interface your pieces with SF101 until you get it all sewn together, unless you are keeping that interfacing out of your seam allowances, so that way it helps take to the curve better. Because if you interface these curves, it's not going to sit as smooth than if you don't. You will also not stabilize this piece until all the pieces are together. Okay, now let's go ahead and sew our rainbow color blocking. Now we'll move on to sewing our rainbow color blocking option. I personally think that this is the more challenging of the color blocking options. It is covered on pages 40 through 44 in the instructions. I will say that it makes it easier to sew if you're using like a quilting cotton and you do not interface it yet. It will help take easier to the curves. If you do interface it before sewing it, make sure that your interfacing is out of your seam allowance. That will help take it to the curve too. You do not want to stabilize this until you have it all sewn together, and then you can attach the full panel stabilizer per the size that you're doing in one whole piece. I'm gonna go ahead and sew this. We're gonna start out with our piece A. Also your color blocking rainbow stripe B. So here's A and B, and you'll have those both right sides up. And we'll flip our piece B over so that the right side's together. And we're gonna match first up this bottom edge. And we're gonna sew a few stitches at our seam allowance, just up this side to hold it together. And you're gonna do it along the curve side. And those are those few little stitches. And this will help keep this part of the arch down. So then you can unflip it and move it to where you can then clip in. But that will keep that part of your seam, like that's flat. That will keep that part of your seam together. And you'll clip along that arch. And I will say that it will help you to pick up your fabric and have it roll into that arch than it is trying to pin this down flat. Because if you try to do it flat, it's not going to take as easily to that curve. I'm also a fan of clips in small sections so that you are working in smaller sections and keeping that fabric together. So you have that curve. Scooch these fabrics a little bit more together. Okay. This is what you're looking like now. It's not going to lay perfectly flat because obviously it's a curve, and this piece of B will not stay along that edge, which is fine because we have it anchored together like it should be. Now we can go in and sew with that 3/8 seam allowance. And now you can go in and either trim notches around your curve or come in with pinking shears and trim your seam allowance so that it helps take to your curve once it's pressed out. And then once you've trimmed, you can turn and press out. You'll see that the bottom ended up meeting and then the top. And again, you can either, depending on how much you trimmed, you can press open or just press to one side. It would be better to press towards this way because of the way that the arch is going. I'm gonna top stitch on that side. Though you don't have to top stitch if you don't want to. I'm gonna top stitch with a 1/8 seam allowance. Okay, so there's that one, and we'll repeat for our other stripes. And we'll attach our piece C. Same way, you'll start them right side up, you'll flip it over and match that edge down. And then you'll do a few little stitches to keep this in place on your curve. So this is that curve. Just gonna stitch up a few. Okay. And we'll turn that to where it matches along that curve, and you'll keep curving it, and you'll match your top part of your curve too. And then you'll work on easing in that arch, which again helps if you are not holding it flat and you're making it go in around the curve. And just arch it. Okay, and then once you've eased that in, well, again, it's not gonna lay flat against this bottom seam. It's gonna stick up, and that's fine because of that holding in stitch point. And again, you're gonna sew with a 3/8 seam allowance. I personally find it easier to sew with that panel that I'm attaching on the bottom side. It seems to take to the arch better. And sewing with that 3/8. again and give it a good press. I'm gonna go ahead and trim my seam with the pinking shears again. Just make sure that you do not cut into your previous stitching. And I am gonna still leave enough so I can top stitch it down, since that's what I'm doing. Okay, and then top stitch with a 1/8 seam allowance. I'm gonna top stitch my top arch, since that's the side I decided to top stitch on. And we'll repeat our same for our stripe D, and right sides up, and then flip to the right sides together. Bring this arch all the way around so you can stitch a few security stitches, and then along that curve. This is my curve, and I just have a few stitches to hold them in place, and that's that straight edge. And you'll take it and turn it back so that it lines up along that curve. And then ease that in. Down sewing with the 3/8 seam allowance. And I will say, always check to make sure that you're happy with your stitching before trimming that seam allowance. Again, press. And then top stitch. And there are 4 of our stripes, and we just have the one more to attach, which is our piece E. And right side up, flip it, and have it to where the whole straight edge is down and across. And you'll want to do your few little tacking stitches. There's my curve. I have my needle at that 3/8. Unclip and then turn this. Pin up to the other side. And again, ease in around the curve. Do not stretching any fabric, just moving them so they fit flatly together. I clipped one stitch too high, so it didn't end up smoothing out when I turned it. So I just took away that one extra little too high of a snip. And that was when I was moving my needle. We'll have that one, and then we'll go in and we'll sew with that 3/8 seam allowance. I will say, especially on this piece, I find it that I have to hold this piece up, and that will help position your fabric along that curve. So I'm holding both of these together to make that arch. If you have a problem easing in your fabrics, that can help. And check that curve. Catching and folding back some of my fabric, so let me unclip that so I can fold that out. There we go. Now that fabric isn't folded back anymore. Okay, and then you can trim that seam allowance with pinking shears or make your notches. Make sure you don't cut into any other layers. And you're just within your seam allowance and you're not getting any stitching. So that seam and top stitch. Top stitching towards the top to keep my seams consistent. And now there is your rainbow color blocking panel, and it is ready to be stabilized, and this will take over your long side panel. So here's our 3 options. You got your rainbow, your striped, and then your block. I hope this part helped everyone for your panel options of the Cascade Duffle. If you have any further questions, make sure you comment below. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please go ahead and give this video a like so I know to continue on making the videos. And as always, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks for sewing with me today, everyone. Happy sewing. Bye.